And I always love to say that in the history of our department, which has produced really amazing people like Steve Smale, we've only given our top two prizes to one person, and that's Jay. So you've got someone really wonderful there. And I looked at the topics within your center, which I think are right on, and really gives the IBS a chance to be the top in the world, I think, in this particular area. So I'm super excited about it. Some of the other speakers will talk about other topics, more in mathematical biology. And a part of the center, though, discusses wearables. So I think this is a very exciting field. And I wanted to just focus in on that wearables and tell you about some of the approaches that we've been using to it. Um, a couple just points. I'll talk a lot about biological rhythms. If you want to know more about biological rhythms, here's an ad for my book on the topic by MIT Press. And by the way, the book is free, available on PubMed, or if you scroll down, you could download it for free on their website. Um, and I should also say that I was lucky that Jay invited me to visit Korea almost exactly 2 years ago. Um, and I put up this picture just so that I would know that in another world, maybe I would be giving this talk in person. And I'm sure if I was giving it in person, I would have really wonderful people to talk with. And on top of that, probably really wonderful food like this. So I missed that very much, but I'm still very happy to be here. Um, let me, before I go on, I just wanted to thank some of the people who did a lot of the work here and some of the funding agencies. I'm going to talk specifically about people's work. And as I do, I'll try and point them out specifically. But just in case I miss someone, I wanted to just put up a bunch of names and mention the people who really did the work. I should also mention that I do have a startup company and a grant from the government to help build that startup company. Um, so what I really want to focus on today are these devices like this Apple Watch, and I think they're really going to change the way we view all sorts of things: mathematical biology, mobile health, human behavior. These little devices are really taking over. Millions and millions of people are using them um, in the world over, and it's giving us tremendous information. Arguably the largest collection of human data, I would say, that's ever been done. Um, and thinking also about the center, because I'm the first speaker, I'm going to take a little time to, just talk very big picture about some of the ways that you could go with this. And when I look at least my career, I've seen three really big events happen in mathematical biology. When I was a graduate student, I call it the tail end of the genome project. And what really made that work, the genome project, was mathematical methods and a lot of open access to data. And the people who really were at the forefront, the mathematicians, had hugely impactful papers with tens of thousands of citations. Likewise, a little later, there was this revolution in neuroscience, and a lot of it was led by fMRI. And again, what made that work was mathematical methods and also access to lots of data. And what I would claim is that we're at the cusp of another very large revolution that's going to happen in terms of these wearables, with all, many great opportunities for people to work in. So what we really need to focus on is first, what are the right mathematical methods for, finding key information from this device, and then also to think about data sets and collecting data sets and sharing data sets so that we could make a lot of progress. And I think that latter part may also be difficult because a lot of these devices and a lot of the data right now, unlike those previous other two cases, are actually controlled by companies. So hopefully they'll be very willing to collaborate and so forth. And there are many exciting areas and many test cases which show quite how much we could push this field and how cutting edge it could be. And For me, I'm super excited by a paper that actually got the cover of Molecular Systems Biology from members of this group. And I think what's really exciting here is that they studied behavior that happens within a single cell, but showed how it could actually relate all the way to wearables and actually drug timing. And I think it really was, uh, an important message for the community that with this work we could actually tie everything together. So I also want to encourage the center to pursue this research because I think it's going to be super impactful. And if you've not read this paper, you absolutely should. Um, so, what are the key questions? And most of this talk is going to talk about the more technical details of my own research. But I just wanted to begin with just a couple general ideas for the center. What are the really hard problems right now? I think one is incorporating systems modeling, doing exactly what the previous paper that I just mentioned did, which is mathematical biology as a field, biomathematics, has had so much success taking physiological data and forming mathematical models out of it. Right now, wearables just collect lots of signals. And the question is, how do you use those two things together? The vast majority of wearable research right now doesn't do this. They just take wearable data, puts it into some sort of a classifier or machine learning, and they've had remarkable results. But I think we're going to get even better results when we know how to incorporate this systems modeling. Um, Another very important question, and this is a question for mathematicians is and statisticians, is how do we deal with a large amount of missing data? If you've seen wearable data, you know it's very messy. People are not collecting this data for your study. Or for your research. They're collecting this data because it's on a wearable and it's helping them. And so you just have to accept the limitations of the data and think clearly in terms of time series and how we could fill in the gaps for this missing data. A good example is many devices people charge overnight when they go to sleep. So all of a sudden that means a third of the data, a third of one's life is missing. How does one think about those things? And we've had a couple preprints and things on that. Um, I mentioned available data sets are going to be very important. But I think the final frontier as well is linking to genomics. So when you have all these very large data sets, and you also have genomic information on individuals, how do you complete that cycle? How can you use genomic information to better predict the behavior of individuals that could be measured by wearables? Um, and we actually, with another former postdoc of mine, Amy Cochran, published at least the first pass at how to link these systems models. It's a paper published in GigaScience. Um, so I think these are, from my perspective, some of the key questions to address. Another thing is I'm going to try and keep things fairly high level and not get into a lot of the more mathematical details, which I'm very happy to do. But for a general center like this, I think general talk, it's better to talk higher level. All right. So there are lots of challenges and opportunities, some of which I've just mentioned. Um, and what I want to do, there are many things one could predict. And I know that my group actually is very interested in predicting sleep. We've had papers on that, predicting and modeling mood, in particular in bipolar subjects. Recent work has thought also about people's weight, which is something that people also record mobily, and how you could predict that. But today I'm going to go back to my own training and my basics and focus on circadian rhythms. Um, and why is it so important? Well, I'll show you two pieces of data. One is a study where people look at fatigue-related accidents on the road. And what you could see is that in the middle of the night, the number of accidents due to fatigue, really peaks. And this peak isn't just due to people having lack of sleep. It's also due to this internal circadian rhythm that causes the body to have less alertness at these particular times of day. In fact, you could even see there's also a bit of a peak that happens later on when individuals are taking, when individuals often will take naps. Um, Likewise, if you look at meter reading errors, this was a study done in Sweden, you'll see that people just as they go about their normal jobs tend to make a lot more mistakes at certain times of the day rather than others. And this leads to lots of um, uh, has led to a lot of the major disasters. For instance, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, or the Challenger accident, have all in some ways been linked not just to a catastrophe, but also the fact that people are trying to react to this catastrophe at times when their circadian clock was telling them that it's not to be particularly alert. Um, so for those reasons, I think it's pretty important. Also, a very large number of people in America, it's about 15 million people, work on shifts. Many people used to travel overseas. That's, as we all know, in this very strange year, stopped. But that I think will start again soon, as we, turn the corner on this pandemic. So this is a major problem for society, not just for health, but also the fact that so many of our businesses work on a 24/7 cycle. Um, and at the heart of this is a circadian clock. So right now we have your clock is telling you to upregulate and downregulate various aspects of physiology depending on what time it thinks it is. Um, so for many of you, when you woke up, there was a burst of hormones, serotonin, adrenaline, which got you to wake up, and blood pressure peaked. And then I'm very glad that for many of you, this talk is occurring at a time of high alertness. Good time to schedule it. I could also mention that this talk is occurring for me near my point of deepest sleep. Um, there's also peak metabolism and greatest strength. So if you want to do athletics, do it in the afternoon. Um, and one of the key markers of circadian rhythms is body temperature. There's a natural daily rhythm in body temperature. So I'll tell you a little more about that. So this is what the physiology of the clock looks like. So there's an internal pacemaking system in something called the suprachiasmatic nuclei. And within every one, or practically all the neurons in this region, is an internal clock. These neurons communicate to each other and time various events. For instance, they time the release of melatonin, a key hormone that helps the body go to sleep. The key synchronizing signal, the key thing that tells our body what time it is light. And that's sensed in the eye, in the retina, by special cells that are devoted specifically to telling the time of day for the circadian clock, in particular, what are called M1 intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. So this is the general sense of the system, that light is sensed here in the retina. It's sent to a pacemaker, and then that pacemaker sends out signals to release various hormones. Um, and some of my earliest work actually came up with mathematical models for this. So in particular, light went into some sort of a preprocessor. I'm sorry, the slides seem to be advancing. I'm not sure what. And then in terms of the processor, then this fed into some sort of a mathematical model for the actual pacemaker itself. And this is one of the first models for this system that I came up with. Light is governed by an intensity I, which is typically measured in lux. And then what it would do is it would affect a preprocessor, and that is could say represent the level of activation or the percent of photoreceptive molecules in the retina related to circadian rhythms that are activated. That's given by n, which is a fraction going from 0 to 1. As these molecules get activated, they then have a signaling cascade, which affects an intrinsic pacemaker, which is given by these equations for X and XC. And if you strip out a lot of the fancy details, you'll see this term here, and just call this one. And then that would give you a very simple model of something called the Van der Pol model, a standard model of an oscillator. So basically what you've got is you've got a model of an oscillator for the circadian clock and a model for a preprocessor for light. Um, this model has been fit to lots of experimental data. And I won't spend too much time talking about this experimental data because I'm going to tell you about some newer data that we've been fitting it to. But here's an example of a traditional protocol that one uses to study circadian rhythms. You'll see a lot of these plots, so it's worth just describing them. These plots are double plotted. So this is day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5. And this is day 1 double plotted, so here and here, just so that you could see patterns. So what you'll see is that someone lives a normal life, let's say going to sleep at midnight, that's what these black bars are, waking up around 8 a.m. And then they do it in the laboratory, and they wake up in near darkness. And for about 40 hours or so, you measure the state of their circadian clock. Then during the next 3 days, light pulses are given. So they have sleep, otherwise they're in general darkness, unless they get these light pulses over the course of 3 days. And then afterwards, you assess the circadian clock again, something called a constant routine, to see how much this light, given at this particular time, has shifted their clock. Another example is here, where the experiment just had the light occurring earlier in the day. And depending on what time the light is given during the day, you will phase shift the circadian clock and get a phase response curve that looks like this. And this is the kind of data that we fit these models to. And here you could see a best fit of the data, as well as our model predictions of the data. And you should see that they match pretty well. So this is laboratory data, but it's been used a lot in the real world. So if you take this data and then put it into some sort of a performance model, you could then put in when people are asleep and awake, and then just see how alert they are when they go to sleep and so forth. And there are lots of software packages, apps, and wearables that one could use. In fact, in my view, I think in the future, many shift workers or people who work, long schedules will be downloading apps just like this and telling them when they're going to be particularly alert and when they're not alert. And that's going to be hugely important. It could allow students to know that if they pull 3 all-nighters, like is shown in this computer simulation, their cognitive throughput, their ability to do well in a math exam, will drop pretty much. It will tell drivers truck drivers, when they should, take a rest from the road. So there's a lot of opportunities here. There's also a lot of opportunities in terms of modeling. Every one of the processes that I've described here can be improved. We're right now working on some improved, sorry about the slide switching, some improved models of the retina and how that processes light. We're also working on some new models of circadian pacemaking in the SEM. And I'm just going to give a brief mathematical aside to tell you about one of them. Um, Interesting work done by Kevin Hene, who was a former graduate student with us. So some of you may be familiar with the classical model of coupled oscillators by Kuramoto. This assumes that the oscillators have some intrinsic frequencies given by a gamma distribution. So this is the distribution for these frequencies. And also, for every one of these oscillators is coupled to all the other oscillators. Sorry, there should be a sum here. I'm sorry, I forgot that. And then what we could do is you could define an order parameter, which basically says how well the oscillators are synchronized. So you take all the oscillators, you plot e to the I theta for their phase, and if they're evenly distributed on the cycle, then the collective amplitude will be 0. Otherwise, it'll be measured by this parameter r, r1, which would be, in essence, if m equals 1, the collective amplitude of all the oscillators. If you take a bunch of oscillators like this, and now we're going to assume that every oscillator represents a different cell in the timekeeping in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, then you could apply some interesting mathematical tricks, similar to what Ott and Antonsen did, and you could then come up with some sort of a description for the coupled oscillators, and that's led to a new mathematical model for us. And again, that's new work that's published in Science Advances. We have a new model. So with these new models, what I'd like to do is I'd like to actually test them with data from the real world. So here, one of the difficulties that we had is that the models themselves take in an input of light. And we know that light is the physiological signal that seems to phase shift the clock. What we also know is that other signals affect circadian timekeeping as well, like activity. And there's a lot of animal experiments, even human experiments, where if you have someone go for a run or do a lot of exercise, this can also shift when the body thinks it is. So what a lot of these wearables measure is activity and not light. The Apple Watch, it actually probably measures some light, but that's not available to developers. What is available is measures like the number of steps taken. So the first question we asked was, the big question was, can we use activity as an input to these models instead of light? And if we could use activity, then it would allow us to, instead of just using a couple devices that use light, to actually measure circadian or predict circadian phase with these models in basically all wearables. So just to get the conversation started, some devices measure both. So we took a large data set using ActiWatches, which are these things which measure both activity and light. And then what you'll see is that during sleep, there could be all sorts of activity. Typically, there's little activity, but sometimes when people sleep, they have, vivid dreams or other things, causes their activity to count, but usually the light levels are extremely low. However, when they're, awake, you'll see that there's a nice correspondence between the overall level of activity and the general light levels. Sorry about this. So as the activity goes up, people tend to be in greater light. So what this did was this allowed us to hypothesize that maybe we could use activity rather than light as the input into these models. So we tried that. We got some data from a collaborator at the University of Michigan named Helen Burgess. And we had her have people wear a device that measured both light and activity, put those into the mathematical models. And then what we did was we had her use a gold standard, the typical marker of the circadian clock that people use. And that's something called DILMO, D-L-M-O. It's when the melatonin starts to peak. And what we did was we took her measurements and the predicted measurements from the mathematical models. And what was very surprising to us was over here, these are the predictions with the light and the error of the predictions. And here's the error of the predictions with activity. And amazingly, we found that just using activity alone did better than light, even though light is the actual signal that people thought about. What I'll do is I'll take you through several other data sets. We were very surprised by this. We tested it with a bunch of other data sets. So again, here are all the subjects. Here's what their error is. And again, the collective error, if you uses the input as activity rather than light, seems to do better. Here are a bunch of other mathematical models as well as also if you just fit a cosine to their activity. And again, you'll see there's a very large error if you just fit a cosine. But the error of this prediction using this data set can be less than an hour if you end up using activity. And it's not quite as good if you use light or machine learning to even predict. So we thought, well, maybe what you need to do is just predict light from the activity using machine learning. And even that didn't do as well. So we actually think that there is some intrinsic signal just in the activity. And this is actually really good news because it makes things, it makes the prediction of circadian phase a whole lot easier. Then we tested it with some other data sets. Another collaborator, Kathy Goldstein.
I have a quick question.
Oh, yes.
Have you tried activity plus machine learning?
Have we tried activity plus machine learning on light? So to have separate signals?
Previously, in previous table, you showed activity is better than light.
Yes. I mean, I think a natural question is, could both of them be used together to do even better? And with some machine learning, we looked at that. We didn't get much better, but it's possible you could.
Okay.
So I also see in the chat a couple other good questions. One, is the model deterministic? In this case, yes. How to incorporate noise in these models is a whole other talk that I just don't have time for. What I will hint at is just 2 days ago, we posted a new type of Kalman filter that we're very proud of to account for noise in these models. That's a student, Ningyuan Wang, and myself. So if you're interested in that, you could, you know, and how to incorporate noise, that's a really good method to do it. The stimuli are very stochastic. I will come to that, and that's very important. In fact, a good reason for this result, it might be where you're just not getting good light measurements. Right now, my Apple Watch is covered by my sleeve. It might think that I'm in darkness. So that might be some of what's, what's affecting things. And I will provide a link to the Kalman filter preprint just as soon as I'm, done speaking, or send that around a little later. If you look at my name or Ningyuan, especially Ningyuan Wang's name, you'll find it. It's called the level set Kalman filter because it uses level set methods.
Danny, sorry, there is one more question about chronotype from the Seongyu Sahun Park.
Okay, yes, and I have to apologize again. For some reason, my
slide. So the question is, circadian rhythm is universal to everyone, or there is a relationship between circadian rhythm and chronotype?
Yes, absolutely. Let me try and be brief in my answer, but I'm tempted to talk for a long time about it. So a major question is, how do you personalize these models? And actually, that great paper that I mentioned earlier starts to do that in a molecular way. But I think this is a wide open question. I think the other thing that this also starts to get at is what's the true definition of chronotypes? Right now, chronotypes are defined based on surveys, like the Munich Chronotype Questionnaire. If we have real data from individuals, can we, and models, and even genetics, can we come up with a better definition of chronotype? That's a whole other talk as well. Anyway, thanks for these questions. Jay, if you just let me know if other people are asking questions in case I don't see.
I will do it. Yeah.
Great, thanks. All right. So we wondered maybe it's the device. So we redid this with the Apple Watch. Again, the better result was, well, actually, here the only result, excuse me, was with activity. Because the Apple Watch, we can't access the light measurements. But nonetheless, we got basically a similar result, an absolute error under an hour. So that made us think that, that it's certainly consistent. Then the real test was data from the Henry Ford health system. near us. Henry Ford of the car maker fame actually had set up a whole health system, and we got data from shift workers, especially Chris Drake, but in particular Philip Cheng, who's a young researcher there. Um, and these are data from individuals who are permanent night shift workers, the hardest people to predict. They're not just going on the night shift for a couple days, then coming back. They're always in the night shift. And what you could see is here's the measured DOMO and the predicted DOMO. You could see the correspondence here is very difficult. In fact, it's very hard to predict these individuals' circadian phase. Um, and one interesting note was that we actually found that the individuals with the lowest circadian amplitude, meaning they had the most disruption, are actually the ones who are the hardest to predict. So that raises a lot of interesting questions. If you work on the night shift for many years, is there a fundamental change to your circadian clock? Interesting question. Anyway, so we did this with various different methods. Let me just skip to the results. As you can see, again, activity outperformed all the other things. So basically what this really suggests is that light and activity are related, but if you want to do field measurements or measure circadian rhythms in the field, activity is a whole lot better than light. And that's really wonderful news because activity is what people actually have and available. And this allows you to predict circadian rhythms in millions of people. Um, so the next part I wanted to talk about is how do we use this information? So we want to not just predict their circadian phase, we want to give them some information, something that they could use. So I'm going to go back in time a little bit, tell you a bit about our InTrain study, and then jump forward in time to a paper that just came out 2 or 3 months ago um, on optimizing schedules. What we could do is now we could look at different schedules and determine, how effective they are. So, for instance, if I went to Korea right now, I would shift my circadian rhythms. I would live on U.S. time, sleep, let's say, for 8 hours, and then I would have a marker here. This is the minimum of my core body temperature. It's what time my body thinks it is, and what based on that, it will time the minimum of the core body temperature, and that should occur a couple hours before I would typically wake up. And then I go across a time zone, I switch 12 hours, my sleep-wake cycle, and as you can see, the circadian clock slowly adjusts. It adjusts about an hour a day is typically what people will measure. And what people are really interested in is how can I speed up this adjustment? For instance, by having people stare at light banks to shift their circadian rhythms. But now we'll get back to the earlier question about what about noise. So a bigger problem going across so many time zones is just the fact that light levels are very stochastic and very noisy. So if I'm supposed to follow a schedule where these are the various light levels I'm supposed to get, in reality, the light levels are probably going to look something like this based on field measurements, just depending on whether there's clouds out or sun out or whether I'm looking at the light or away from the light. And if you put that into one of these models, here's what the model says without noise, and these blue dots are what the model says with noise, different individuals. So we'll take one set of blue dots as one individual plus all that noise. And as you could see, there's a huge spread of behaviors. This probably matches your experience when you go across all these time zones. Sometimes you'll adjust very quickly, like these people over here, and sometimes you'll adjust very slowly and things just won't work out. Um, so it's not just a question of how quickly you entrain people, it's also a question of how uniformly you entrain them. So we use some optimal control methods to come up with optimal schedules, and lo and behold, this, as I said, was older work. We were able to show that you could shift people in 2 or 3 days if they followed the right time, the right lighting schedule. What was also nice is that the lighting schedule was bang bang, meaning either you want darkness or light, and really nothing in between. So get as much or as little light as possible. we have schedules for every possible time zone, and we wanted to test these, in particular, test them in an app. So we created an app called InTraining and gave it to travelers. You still can download it. And you give it your lighting history and your patterns, and it will tell you the optimal schedules based on these models to adjust you to a new time zone. Now, we didn't actually imagine people would follow these schedules too well because they have lots of other things going. And these are mathematical solutions. And it doesn't care about whether the optimal solution might say you have to stare at light for 20 hours or be in darkness for 20 hours. And real people probably are going to have problems doing it. Nonetheless, we released it. This is what the app was. And here's one of my favorite slides. Um, the app went viral for a little while. It was in the top 10 free travel apps. And you'll see this is at the time, the market capitalization of the other apps in billions of US dollars. And we did this basically for free. So it was one of the most surreal experiences. Literally, my office phone, I stopped answering it because it was all reporters or travelers asking us questions or other things. But we did collect a lot of data. Particular, Olivia Walsh built the app, and we had a lot of statistical help from a postdoc, Amy Cochrane. We ended up collecting data from the entire world, including, as you'll see, Korea. And the demographics were pretty good. We actually have a much larger data set that we haven't looked at now, but eventually we'll start looking at. We tried to figure out what people were doing. So first of all, let's just talk about sleep. When people typically go to sleep and when they wake up. And one of the interesting things was if you're only sleeping for 5 hours, you tend to go to bed later, but not really change when you wake up. However, when you sleep more like 10 hours, you tend to sleep in more. Um, uh, Another interesting thing is we looked at the entire population and we saw how spread out was their sleep timing and their wake timing, and how did that change as a function of age. And perhaps not surprisingly, as we age, as people tend to sleep in a lot more uniform way, and there's a lot less variation. And a surprising finding at the time that was very controversial, but now it's become accepted, is the fact that we found that women tended to schedule a little bit more sleep than men, typically about 20 minutes or so. And this was typically done by going to bed, but not exclusively going to bed just slightly earlier. So here's when they go to bed and when they wake up as a function of age. And of course, you could see that people wake up earlier as they age. So that was interesting, and mainly it was because middle-aged men, people in my age bracket, tend to get very little sleep, and that was one of the major problems. And Jay, with your new center and aging, you may find yourself like me pretty soon. Anyway, yes. Oh, okay. So I'll skip some of these details in the interests of time, and I want to leave some time for questions. Let me just mention one other thing. It's well known that people in different countries spend different amounts of time sleeping. So we wanted to know, why do people in certain countries like France sleep more than people, than people from other countries like Japan? By the way, South Korea, I think we didn't quite have enough data from South Korea here to put it on the chart. But what we typically found was if you look at sleep duration, it's a function of when people wake up and when they go to bed, that sleep duration correlates very nicely with bedtime, but not with wake time. What this means is that when people are getting less sleep, they're staying up later. And that's what's happening in a lot of these cultures. And there are lots of other questions you could ask about these sorts of things. So what we think is the modern sleep crisis right now is really caused by two things. First of all, your circadian clock telling you got to wake up at certain times of the day. or light, and likewise society governing when you go to sleep. And many times when we're about to go to sleep, society wakes us up. Or how many of you have been about to go to sleep and, oh, you just have to check your email one last time or something like this. So I think that's, and the problem is that one needs a set amount of sleep, and sleep is like a spring, and it's getting compressed on both sides. The circadian clock is saying, no, 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 you have to wake up in the morning, and society is saying, no, no, you need to stay up later. Um, what I really wanted to get to was a paper that just came out. It was in 2020, but it was published on, I think, December 28th or something like that. Um, Testing some of the ideas that we had in the app and presenting some more of the data, um, showing you what you could do with this. So we had data from all over the globe, and the data I just showed you was on sleep timing. Now I'd like to, and self-reported sleep timing. Now I'd like to use their wearable data, their activity data, to predict their circadian phase. Because now I've validated that with the other studies that I've told you about. So some simple things you could just test. People, if you just use their activity and put it into these mathematical models, you could see that it correlates very nicely with their time zone, or what continent they're in. Um, there was a slight difference in the phase for men and women or with age, but not statistically significant. Next, we also in this app, remember, we're giving people an optimal schedule. So I think this is a really important test case for now that you've solved some sort of an optimal problem with the mathematical model, now that you have a recommendation, do people actually follow it? And are they better off for it? Because you could have the most perfect mathematical model and you could have the most perfect numerical method and people ignore it or they don't, it's not very practical. So actually what we did was we had a simple measure of mood. And what we hoped is that people who use the app had higher mood, where in general, it's this positiveness score, and that somehow by using the app, they also adjusted quicker. So in terms of positiveness, there were slight effects in terms of, age and gender. They tended to be more positive if their predicted phase was correct rather than off by about 2 hours. This is a well-known result that we reproduced. Traveling west, people tend to be more happier or have higher mood than if they're traveling east. Um, but also remember the app is telling them based on this optimal control problem and when they're waking up or going to sleep, when they should be active and when they should be not active and in darkness. And so what you could do is you could look for individuals who are slightly active or very active when they're in darkness. How positive are they? How good is their mood? And it's variable, but if they're highly active, when the app is telling them to be darkness, they tend to have lower moods. Likewise, if they're highly active, when it's telling them to actually have light, their mood actually increases. So this actually is telling us that even though and you'll see from the next slide, they're ignoring a lot of the results, they're actually using this, and this is having some sort of a direct benefit to them, at least is measured in terms of mood. What people actually do in the real world is a mess. Here's an example of someone who went on 3 separate trips and documented it for us. Um, and again, you can see their step count. The first trip, they followed the app really nicely. You'll see the activity corresponded very nicely with these light dark cycles. Second, not so much. And by the third trip, they basically ignored it. So we were interested in how much are we really actually changing people's behavior. And by giving them these optimal predictions, we are finding we're actually able to change their behavior some in a real measurable way, but we're not completely changing everything. So if you look at the local time, whether we tell them to be light or dark, you could see that at certain times of the day, if we tell them to be light, they're more likely to be light, but in general, they're following the local time. when they're going across these time zones. Um, this also, you could look at whether you're in lightness or darkness. Oh, I'm sorry about this. Um, how oh, um, how long it is. So, is there a difference depending on whether we ask them to be in light or darkness for 5 hours or 20 hours, or also on these east-west shifts? And one of the things we typically find is that short westward trips. So if you go to a time zone to the west, just a couple time zones, people tend to ignore the schedules or have more activity in darkness and things. They're hard schedules to follow, actually. And for just a couple time zones, people I think just aren't willing to do it. They just, they're not willing to follow these optimal schedules. Whereas for larger time zones, they're more motivated to do so. Um, so again, basically the takeaway message here is that the app is actually having in these optimal schedules are actually having a measurable effect, but nonetheless, we're not actually dictating what people are really doing. Um, now, about noise and variation, there are lots of things that affect this. So one of the questions is how accurate is what we're actually doing? So we could vary the initial conditions. And as we vary initial conditions, um, you see you have different starting points and different endpoints. Again, the circadian clock would be a circle here. And these are your initial conditions and your final conditions. Um, and so varying initial conditions, not knowing exactly where they are, the accuracy of the models to begin with can have a measurable variation on their on how they behave. The actual light levels tend not to matter that much, but determining when they start their day and when they stop their day can have also a very large effect. And so what we could do is then we could track how individuals go across time zones and also show different types of optimal schedules for them to follow. So what we could imagine is imagine people all over the world are coming to a special conference at the IBS. Um, so at a given time, and we'll look at it every day, they start, here's our X and XC variables and their circadian phase, you can imagine as a circle. And that involves everyone's possible circadian phase. And they all want to get to one particular phase, the particular phase in Korea. Um, so here are some sample trajectories day by day by day where you could see every day how far had they adjusted and how close they've come to Korea. And so you see they take sort of a circuitous route. Eventually they get there, see this person is going back and forth quite a bit. Um, these are the optimal schedules. So if they follow the schedules perfectly, this says how quickly they would be able to adjust. Um, and then what we actually find, what works best is for you to continue to measure the circadian clock and account for the noise. And every time they deviate from one of these schedules, just put them on another one of the schedules. So interpolate between all these schedules. And that actually gives a pretty efficient way to get across these time zones. And is sort of a medium between just saying, here's an optimal schedule, and here's what you would just normally do. So in that way, you let people decide when they want to have meetings. Of course, they're going to do it when they're going to be able to go to light, when they want to have dinner, things like this. But they also have this optimal schedule that's continually evolving. And actually, this is the kinds of optimal schedules that are now built into InTrain. And we also can solve optimal control problems. I'll skip some of these details, but basically to say we could put on some additional constraints and not really affect the amount of time it takes. So someone just mentioned monitoring sleep. So that's a whole other thing that we also would like to build into this. And I think that's a great question. And they were talking about the different types of sleep and also the quality of sleep and how restorative the sleep is. So I think those are all great questions. One final point, we actually looked at all these optimal schedules and saw what would happen if you stop the schedule halfway or at other points during the schedule. So rather than presenting them a whole optimal schedule, what if you were to just have them follow the first, quarter of it or the first half of it or more, and then just tell them follow the local time zone? What we found is that if you stop it before like the halfway point, the schedules will, not really work and they'll be pretty bad. But pretty much past the halfway point, then people will just sort of naturally adjust by going on the new time zone. All this is to say that there are a lot of key tweaks we can make to these schedules, based on interpolations and new constraints in the optimal control that will make them a lot easier to follow. Wanted to leave some time for questions, but let me just mention one last thing that we've built. So this is a new app. You could download it for Android or iPhone called the Social Rhythms app. And if you download it, it'll ask you some basic questions. We set it up for social distancing during, the lockdowns, but you could use it a lot more generally. Um, and what you do is you download the app and you also submit your heart rate and step data. And it'll take data from any one of these devices. And then it's all anonymous. So this is key. The information we get from you is we get the heart rate and steps, but we don't know who you are. And we have no way of contacting you other than anonymously through the app. Um, and you also can remove your data anytime at any time. And I should also say that now at this point, about 2,000 people have used this app. So we've gotten data from about 2,000 people. And there's a whole IT infrastructure, but and there are a bunch of reports that are coming. But one of the reports that we have right now is it will take the data that you have, and then it'll run the model. It'll show you your activity over time, and it'll show the state of your circadian clock, and it'll say how much your circadian clock has changed because of the lockdown. Now, we're actually in the process of updating the app that it's not just about the lockdown. It also will tell you how much your circadian clock, whether it shifted later or become more regular or less regular after other key life events, like having a child or starting a new job or opening a new center or other things. So I'd also encourage you to check out this app, and there's a lot more coming with it. So I did want to leave at least some time for questions, but maybe I could just stop there and summarize by, again, saying how excited I am to be hearing about this center. I think it's absolutely wonderful. And, I'm so lucky to be able to be giving this talk. To also say that mobile technology and just wearables is this huge area, but there are so many great questions. Questions about the data, questions about how to incorporate physiology into it, questions also about what do you do, not just measuring systems, but how do you give them optimal advice? And then once you have that optimal advice, what do you do about the fact that in the real world, they're probably not going to follow a lot of this advice? And how do you come up with even better schedules? And then how do you deploy it in terms of apps? There's a lot of these large standing questions. And to be honest, these are questions that are very hard for a single researcher, normal researcher to answer, but is something that I think a center can uniquely answer. So anyway, it's wonderful to be here, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Danny, for giving a great talk. So I think all questions you wrote down in the chatting rooms have been answered by Danny. Oh, okay. There is another question. So you can leave the question in the chat room, or you can raise a hand, and I will unmute. But there was a first question from Pesuarez from Philippines, I think.
Yeah, so I think that a very good question. And I think part of this actually gets to why we were finding that activity is a better predictor than light, because there are these interesting scenarios. What happens if someone is asleep, is what the question is asking, but the light is turned on. And one might assume that, the eyelids block out a lot of light, but they certainly don't block out all the light. And I think that's another question is how do you measure how much light is actually getting to these cells?
Yeah.
And it's very hard to measure that from a wrist-worn device. That being said, um, saying activity is more important than light turned out to be a more controversial statement for the field. And I think that's why we looked at so many different data sets. But I think two even more surprising things came out. I think it's not just the fact that we're not measuring light well, or that we don't know how to deal with situations like the question asked about being asleep, but also being exposed to light. I think it's actually that activity has an effect phase shifting the clock on top of that, and
Mhm.
that we're also picking some of that up too. The other thing is I think we're also seeing that permanent night shift workers, when we try and predict their circadian phase, we do much worse. Rather than plus or minus an hour, we're plus or minus 2.5 hours. That's also what's coming out in some other studies as well. So the question there as well is why, is there something fundamentally different about these individuals? When you work on the night shift, is it fundamentally changing your circadian clock? And my guess is the answer actually is yes.
Mhm.
Um,
Okay.
anyway,
So there
thanks
is
for the
another question from Aurelia.
okay.
Maybe Aurelia, you can unmute.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Hi, Daniel. Thank you so much for that very interesting and wonderful talk. I have a couple of questions. One is regarding the measurement. You already mentioned something about this noise, but I could understand that there's a variability among subjects, but sometimes there's also variability within the subject itself. And sometimes measurement is influenced by a lot of aspects like emotions or sometimes even you're sleeping, you have a nightmare and there's a peak in your measurements or whatever. And so the question is, do you smoothen the data or how do you remove these outliers, uh, so to speak, or
Sure.
yeah, so how would you detect if that is really an outlier, like for example you cough at night
Yeah.
and
All right.
you jerk or whatever. Mhm.
Yeah. So that's lots of wonderful questions. Let me try and parse them. We don't. We, in general, don't remove outliers,
Mhm.
but one has to be careful as well about some of the data we're getting is self-reported. And some of it is like the mood data certainly is self-reported rather than physiological measures. And I'd say it's a lot harder to, develop outliers when you're looking at physiological measures than with self-reported things. That being said, certainly there are times when the measurement device doesn't work or other things. And we have had a lot of luck with these, self-reported measures. Um, the interesting thing is we also find that the circadian clock, I think, inherently pays attention to certain signals and not others. So if I just go back a bunch of slides, it's not letting me go back. Sorry about that. Uh, Here we go. So for instance, in this particular case, if you vary the light levels, it actually doesn't really affect, you know, uh, how well you entrain or where you end up. So I guess the other thing I would mention answering your question is that certain things really seem to matter and certain things really don't. So you also have to think about, these outliers and these effects. Is it something that's really going to change things or not?
Mm.
Um, and I mean, but I think some of the questions you're raising are very general.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
Can I
Yeah,
have another question?
Uh,
yeah,
yeah, Aurelio, you
Yeah.
can
uh,
uh, give me a second. There
yeah,
was
sure,
another
sure.
question before
Yeah.
you ask. Danny, there was one question from Mia Cha in the chatting room.
yep.
Actually,
I see the
he's
question.
a,
So the question is,
director. Yeah.
how has the lockdown affected people's, sleep and circadian rhythms? Um, what I could tell you is that we've collected some data on this, and we're processing it. The sleep part, though, there was a data set from the UK Biobank,
Mhm.
and 2 or 3 papers have just like in the past couple weeks come out about how the lockdowns, in particular COVID, has changed people's sleep patterns, and typically they've slept a bit more. As for analysis of how this has affected circadian rhythms, this is ongoing work for us. Um,
I see.
so I don't have a direct answer to that yet.
And
Um,
there is a question about child's sleep. Can you see it, Danny?
yes. Yep. So I think in general, what's happened is that because the lockdowns, people are getting less synchronizing signals
Mhm.
from. They're spending more time indoors. They're not interacting with other people as much, and because of all that together, they're not getting as strong a circadian synchronizing signal. So I think that's certainly something that we have some preliminary data to show, and something that that I think what you're saying is indeed global.
I see.
Um,
Gotcha.
then robustness. How do we clean the data, find abnormalities and so forth? Yeah. So I think the one performs, and if you look at these papers, you'll see a host of statistical tests that we use. But what I also want to advocate for is synthetic data. So we spend a lot of times just thinking about what the data should look like, coming up with synthetic data, applying the techniques to it, and seeing, do we get the same answer that we got before?
Mhm.
And how accurate was that? And I think that that's actually another important way to go. But I do think that the error of a lot of these models needs to be better quantified.
Mm.
So I think that's another area to talk about.
Okay.
Um,
And there is one.
Testing data. Okay. Um, Missing data. We have a preprint on this. So actually, I'll probably stop sharing screen.
Mhm.
Um, and if I could, and I'll try and pull up the preprint, and I'll put it in the chat, and also put up the preprint from the Kalman filter. Um, so if you just give me a minute to
Yeah.
do that,
Problem. On hurry.
I will do that. Are there other questions while I look this up? Did we, for them, just I can't see you at the moment, so just feel free to just
Yeah.
call out.
If I may ask, in between a very light question, as a expert in sleep research, how is your sleep? How do you manage your sleep to be a successful scholar?
Um, that's uh, yeah. No comment.
As far as I
It,
know,
it,
he don't sleep
yeah,
much. He doesn't
yeah.
do.
And I've asked clinicians who go around telling everyone about how you know about how important sleep is,
Mhm.
and then I'll ask them that same question, and they will give the same sort of answer. I wish I followed the
Yeah.
recommendations, but
Actually, Danny, Mia Cha is the one you may want to meet here when you come to here. Actually, she is a director of the data science group in IBS,
oh, wonderful. Okay.
and she is also expert in wearable data
Oh,
analysis.
wow. Oh, good.
So you should want to discuss when you visit here.
Great.
Really
I
looking
do
forward
hope
to
that
seeing
I'll
you
visit
in
soon.
person.
Yeah, one more reason to come Korea.
Sure. No, I would absolutely love it.
Yeah. Okay, so Aurelio, maybe you can ask one more question. Actually, that's what maybe you can unmute and then please ask the
Yeah,
follow-up question. Yeah.
yeah. I think I missed the slide when you show this optimal control problem. So I'm just interested how the objective functional is formulated, because of course your results will be um, dedicated. I mean, it will be influenced by the landscape of your objective functional.
Absolutely
Yeah.
correct. Yep, right on. So the main thing we're trying to minimize is, so basically it's a pursuit problem where you start in one time zone and end in another time zone. Realize that that's not a fixed state space you're trying to get from one time zone to another, because the state space changes, you know, in time as time progresses, because people's clocks continue to change phases. So you want to catch that pursuit problem in minimum time. So typically the cost is mainly, you know, just time. But you know, we could put in, and if you read our latest paper in PLOS Computational Biology, we could put in other constraints, for instance, or other costs. For instance, a cost for that penalizes darkness for more than 8 hours, because people don't like that, or something that would penalize, you know, light periods for less than 5 hours. And you're right, a lot of these there are a lot of different cost functions that one could think about. You could put in cost functions for, you know, for all sorts of scenarios. And I think part of the problem is that these models are actually quite stiff.